Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Philippe Defraign. I'm a director with Cullen International, and I'll be your moderator for this afternoon. I'm joined by Annemarie Sipkes, who is a BEREC Chair 2022, and also a director in charge of telecom, transport, and postal at ACM in the Netherlands. Annemarie, good afternoon. And I think together we'd like to welcome everyone to this BEREC Stakeholder Forum. Annemarie, we have this time to hold this meeting again online, which is a bit unfortunate. Especially, we'll be missing the networking around a glass of wine later today, sadly. But you are planning something more interesting for later this year, I understand.
Yes, Philippe, thank you. And although it is from a distance, I'm very happy to be here. But it's true. Because of COVID, we cannot meet in Brussels in person. So we decided to have 2 stakeholder forums this year. The first one today to mark the launch of our call for input for the work program 2022. And one later this year when we hopefully can meet in Brussels to deepen our dialogue between the stakeholders on the one hand and members of BEREC on the other.
Fingers crossed. I hope this will happen. And back to the meeting today. Many people are familiar with the functioning of BEREC in the audience, but perhaps some not so much. You will be the BEREC Chair 2022 next year. Could you tell us why you're in charge of the organization of the forum this afternoon? So a year ahead of your chairmanship.
And already very hard at work, yes.
Already hard at work.
The thing is, we all share, I think, stakeholders and BEREC members alike, the importance of contributing to a well-functioning European market for electronic communication services. And the dialogue between all parties concerned is very important. And I think one of the major events on which we actively seek input from our stakeholders is when it comes to our work program for next year. So that is the agenda that I am responsible to make sure that is executed up to standard. And so today marks a very important step in the dialogue that we have in all different occasions and with different questions. But today focuses on what should be the priorities that BEREC has and the work that we should carry out next year.
Yeah, and absolutely. And later on this afternoon, we'll have a Q&A with the audience, question from the audience to discuss input for this work program 2022. If we look at the agenda for the afternoon, we have important topics such as 5G or technological innovation and end user right. But I've noticed we've got at least 2 sessions on sustainability, Annemarie. And if I'm not mistaken, BEREC has no mandate, sorry to be a bit direct, but BEREC has no mandate in that field. So is it not an overkill, 2 sessions on sustainability?
Well, I think sustainability is a very important topic for Europe at large. And I think that we all should think about, are we, with the work that we do and within the mandates that we have, are we helping consumers and companies to be as sustainable as they can be? Are we perceived to be a hindrance, or can we actually help or stimulate? And that is a work that we are exploring at the moment at BEREC, and I think it's very important because I think it is very important for all of us to keep in mind the public goals that we all try to achieve here. So a good functioning market of electronic communication services is not a goal in itself. It is a means to make sure that we have a proper functioning Europe that helps companies and people alike. And sustainability is part of that challenge, in my view.
Absolutely, and more on this later this afternoon. Thank you very much, Annemarie. We'll see you again a bit later in the afternoon. And I'm delighted to welcome our next speaker, Stefan Schweinfest. Stefan, it's really wonderful to have you. You are the director in charge of the statistics division in the United Nations. I read that you were recently awarded sorry, you were granted an award for making a difference in science and public policy. I'm telling you, there are a lot of people in this room who'd love to get such an award. And it triggered my curiosity, and I watched you online for a few interviews that you gave. I mean, you're passionate about statistics and about unleashing the power of data and this ability you've developed of mixing numerical data and data close to the heart of telcos, which are geospatial data. And you know what, you're passionate about data stewardship and how statistical I like that one, how statistical offices can beat fake news. I think I don't know whether it will be, perhaps not your topic for today, but you know, and if you allow me, and I mean this as a compliment, Stefan, I think you make statistics rock. Okay, Stefan, over to you.
No, thank you very much for the invitation. I don't know. I think there was supposed to be an introduction video to give you a little bit of a flavor of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals that I'm coming from.
Simon, can you launch the video? Absolutely.
So thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for the video. Now I feel a little bit more at home because all these are all the images that I need to feel comfortable. Because I must confess, when I was first asked to speak at this forum, I was of course honored, and I asked my staff, should I really do that? I think there are a lot of scary people in that room, because they are all very, very tech savvy, and there are telecommunication companies and regulators, and they will definitely push me out of my comfortable bureaucratic comfort zone. And but then my colleague said, no, well, you know, the invitation comes from the Netherlands, and so the Dutch are nice people. They speak many languages. They are internationally engaged, and we have had so many wonderful cooperations with the Netherlands, both in the area of statistics and geospatial information management. So, and my motto is always, if different professional groups start talking to each other, there's a real danger that we start understanding each other. I was a little bit intimidated by the title. I said, how can 5G contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals? And I thought, who am I? A director who is sometimes known for disconnecting entire meetings by pushing the wrong button, answer that complicated question. But then I thought, I don't have to answer it alone. I think that's what we want to do together here today. That's how I understand it. It's a big question. I mean, we have the biggest technological breakthrough and development of this moment, of this time, the 5G technology coming to us, and we have on the other side perhaps one of the biggest development human agendas in the history of mankind, the Sustainable Development Goals. And how are these two related? How can they be related? And I know the Sustainable Development Goals, you all know 5G, and I think if we start talking to each other, then I think we will figure out the answer to that question. I mean, how 5G can actually contribute. Let me then talk a little bit about the United Nations Sustainable Development Agenda. I think, and perhaps we can show my first and second slide for this. This is just my complicated last name and my title, but then the next slide has a little bit of an image. I mean, the Sustainable Development Goals are covering three big pillars: the social area, environmental area, and the economic areas. And they are perhaps the most ambitious and universal development agenda from 2015 to 2030. Where I come in as a director of statistics, I need to help to provide the information systems, the data, and I'm talking very broadly here. I did not say statistics, I said information systems and data deliberately. What is the measurement background to support the goals, to know where we are, how we are navigating towards the goals, where we are falling behind, who is falling behind. So because the Sustainable Development Goals were also an accountability framework, the idea was through the United Nations, we hold each other accountable to reach the goals. So, I mean, one of the important jobs of my office is to present an annual report to the General Assembly where we are with the Sustainable Development Goal indicators, where we are on that journey. So my life has dramatically changed. I used to be a very comfortable director of statistics, and I was worrying about issues like census taking and national accounts. And now suddenly I'm talking about data ecosystems, data stewardship. People are even starting to say data are sexy. That was not something that I was told when I started my profession. And but it is really, I think, the development agenda and evidence-based decision making have thrown the importance of data really into the limelight. We just had a funny exchange the other day with another colleague who has worked 30 years in statistics, and he said it used to be that when we got into the media, that was a bad news. As a statistical office, you tried to stay out of the front page news because it was usually bad news, and nowadays it's good news, because statistics and data are an enabler to help us to reach the development goals. Especially now in the COVID crisis, perhaps I can say a few words. I think the COVID crisis in particular has highlighted the power of information and communication technology. Just imagine we had lockdowns 15 years ago. How would we have communicated? How would we have had these types of meetings that we are having right now around the world? I'm talking to you early morning from New York, and very happy to do so. So this is really, the COVID crisis and I'm perennially optimistic. A crisis is always an opportunity. So it has highlighted the importance of data. It's a real data moment. And as I'm responsible not only for statistics, but geospatial information also, I was very happy that during the crisis, one of the things we saw a lot were maps with data, because that's exactly the integration of different data types that we are talking about. And the crisis has also led to many innovations at the national statistical level. The data collection has changed because our classical tools used to be censuses and surveys. But during the crisis, it's really a bad idea to knock on somebody's door with a questionnaire in your hand and ask some questions. So we have used telephone surveys. We have started to use innovative data sources. I mean, data from telephone companies have become a very important input into the management of the data of the COVID crisis, because with the telephone records, you can keep an eye on the movements of people. And there have been many agreements between national statistical offices and telephone companies to get access to information. And so private information has been converted into a public good. And that is exactly, I think, what we are talking about. In my office, we have two perhaps not so well-known programs. One is about big data. So these are not the traditional official statistics of census and national accounts and environment statistics and these kind of things that we know, and education statistics, etc. But we're asking ourselves how big data that are sort of accidentally produced and generated, can be used for official statistics. And we have a whole program asking ourselves how satellite data, how scanner data in supermarkets, how telephone records can be used, mobile data, phone data, for the purposes of official statistics, to generate statistics. And we have made quite some progress in the area, for instance, of tourism statistics and migration statistics. But perhaps the biggest change in my office 10 years ago was when we fully integrated the geospatial information program. And I can say everything happens somewhere. So geospatial information, and perhaps we can go to the next slide. My slides are mostly to whet your appetite and put things that I say visually a little bit into context. And So geospatial data, and in particular geospatial data and mobile phone data together, and we can go to the next slide, are very important because geospatial data bring the community together. They are the integrators. Everything happens somewhere. So economic, social, and environmental information. These are the three pillars of the SDGs. Remember the three circles at the beginning. They can be brought together by geospatial information. And the data flow is also interesting. I always think about the little data item being born at the micro level, at the local level, but then it flows to the municipality, it flows to the regional level, it flows to the national level, to the continental level, and the global level. And at each level, decisions are being taken. And it's a bit my job, our job at the United Nations, to organize that data flow so that all the data from the micro level to the macro level are coherent, that there is a data architecture. And we do that, of course, in the traditional statistical areas by way of norms and global definitions and training. And we are doing this also in geospatial information now. Now, the connection with the mobile phone is obvious. I mean, because and 5G will really enable geospatial and unleash geospatial information. Because it is an opportunity. Geospatial information is, of course, heavy but with the 5G technology, we will be able to bring geospatial information really to the fingertips of everybody. And I think just of myself, how I use the phone and geospatial information, how my usage has changed. Just a week ago, I was looking for a vaccination center and a COVID test center on my phone. I found it. I found how to get there. I found where to find my city bike to go to that location. I'm using my telephone and geospatial information every minute of my day to find a restaurant, to look out of the window in the morning and beef up my own impression of the meteorological situation and find the local weather forecast, which is now so refined that I can literally find out whether it's going to be raining in my street or not. Next slide. I mean, one of the big areas where geospatial information and 5G can help us a lot is, for instance, just to give you one area, and this is also related to two of our development goals, is urban growth management. Think of city planning. I mean, what geospatial information and communication can help us there. City is where the urban and the rural intersect. I mean, we have different ecosystems. We have the urban area, we have the rural area around, we have forest area, agricultural area, recreational area. We can describe the economics infrastructure, the social infrastructure, the schools and hospitals, the physical infrastructure, the buildings, and even the plumbing underneath the city. I've seen 3D images. And all of this is very much tied to the SDGs. The SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, they live from the basic insight that everything is connected. Everything is connected. The social, the environmental, and the economic. You always remember the three circles that I showed at the very beginning. The basic philosophy of the Sustainable Development Goal is one of connection. And this is, of course, where also the 5G technology comes in. I move from the cities in my next slide to the opportunities of precision agriculture. You can see that, I mean, with the technologies that we have right now, we can help in the rural areas. We can help guide the positioning of seeds, fertilizers, the use of water, making sure that economic management and environmental management coincide. So these are all the new tools give us the power to do that. And this is, of course, something that is very important. So in my next slide, I want to make the argument that 5G is basically not only about connectedness, but it's really about connections between humans, But we do have a big challenge, and the challenge is the one of the digital divide, because we have some that have access to this technology and some that don't. But 5G technology is precisely the tool that can help us to bridge that divide, because I mean it can help developing countries to be connected to the rest of the world. And at the United Nations, we are of course all about the connectedness between countries. So just finishing with my last two slides, the visuals, to give you a little bit of a flavor of where we are going and where we can go. What does this gentleman, the farmer in a developing country, have to do with 5G and geospatial information? Well, if he has access to weather information, then he can do a better job at what exactly he is doing. And if he has access to a system of market prices and digital economy, he will be able to connect to the local and global markets. And so this the technology will help us to overcome the digital divide. The divide exists, and I like this last image, and I want you to leave you with this, because even in the urban areas, we have it sometimes next to each other, the rich and the poor, the haves and the haves not. But the technology and 5G technology can give people access to critical information, life-saving information, access to data on services. And let's not forget, the motto of the Sustainable Development Goals is leave no one behind, and that is true at the individual level as well as at the country level. So any tool that helps to increase our connectedness, I think, is certainly welcome, but it has to be managed as a process of digital transformation. And it is challenging, and we will have to address complicated issues such as data management, data privacy versus data access, etc. But that's exactly where many stakeholders have to come together: governments, private sector, civil society, academia, in order to manage all of these challenges together. And I leave it here. I've thrown out a lot of seeds, a lot of ideas, and I'm happy to take questions and follow up on
Thank
points
you.
that you would like
Thank
to
you,
know.
Stefan. We'll see you we'll continue the conversation in a few minutes. I'm now delighted to introduce our next speaker, Dan Sjöblom, who is, you know him all very well. He used to be BEREC Chair last year and is, of course, still Director General of PTS in Sweden. And Dan, delighted to have you to discuss about the 5G as well, same topic, from another perspective, the 5G radar that BEREC is launched last year. And so the goal of this radar is really to anticipate regulatory change that are necessary to cope with technological development. I don't recall that we needed a radar to cope with 4G, Dan. So why does BEREC feel the need of a radar for 5G?
Thanks, Philippe, and good afternoon from me to everyone. I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with the 5G radar, so I thought I'd just say a few introductory words about the 5G radar that was produced by BEREC last year. It says exactly as you said, a document that tries to sort of in a visual way point out some of the challenges and things that we need to be aware of in terms of 5G. 5G is, of course, a strategic priority of BEREC. It was under the previous strategy period, and it continues to be for the period up until 2025, because a lot of things are happening. What needs to be said also maybe is that the idea behind the document is for us, the NRAs, for BEREC, for stakeholders. It's a document that points out some of the many aspects that come into play when you talk about development of 5G. Standards, interoperability issues, business models, spectrum, quality of service, security, many things that we all need to be aware of, and you cannot work on everything at the same time. So the radar also tries to set out a little bit of a priority timing issue management for all of us. It's also useful to just underline that the radar is, of course, a snapshot at the moment in time when it was produced and adopted by us. And that was essentially prior to the pandemic. So, of course, a lot of things have been learned by everyone in terms of the timing. So I think it's of course a document that will be useful to update at some periodical intervals. We are here to start with the launch of ideas for Work Programme 2022, and that might be indeed one of them. Now, to your question, Philippe, why didn't we do the same kind of document for 4G? And I think essentially the answer is that the 5G ecosystem impacts so much more of our lives and our businesses and everything. So it's much more complex for many reasons. And the role of the NRA is therefore also going to be more complex and multifaceted. So it's useful to have this document that keeps us sort of aware of all these complications and the need for prioritization.
And then usually when operators hear the need for regulatory change to cope with technological innovation, they translate it into more regulation is on its way. Is this what they should fear or not?
Well, I can understand the fear. This is an area where so much is happening, so much new regulation is coming all the time. So, of course, I cannot sit here and say it will not be more regulation, but it doesn't necessarily have to be so. It can also be smarter regulation. I think that's what we're all intending to do. And I think the radar should help both NRAs and stakeholders to anticipate the issues involved and be aware of the pace and the type of innovation that we are looking towards.
Yeah. And as you said, the radar associated to each regulatory issue a ranking, whether it's a high level, a high priority issue, medium priority, low priority, and a timing, whether it's an issue for this year or for BEREC to look at it next year and so on. And I was a little bit surprised to see that network slicing was medium importance for next year. I mean, if you remember a couple of years ago, the debate was raging on that net neutrality was going to kill optimized services. And now I see in the radar that these are medium important issues for next year. So how do you square that?
Yeah, well, I think you gave part of the answer yourself. We did have a few years back or some time back, I don't exactly recall when it was, we did have a good discussion with many stakeholders. There were these concerns that you mentioned about the interplay between, in particular, network slicing and the net neutrality regulation. We produced in 2018 an opinion evaluating the functioning of the regulation, and the conclusion at that time was that we didn't really see this fear. We had really been canvassing knowledgeable, resourceful persons and organizations for concrete examples of where this problem would indeed occur. How would the network neutrality regulation impede 5G technology? And it really was very vague, and we couldn't come up with any firm conclusions. So I think we are of the opinion that the two work together, actually. So that's why we have not prioritized it at the very highest and most immediate levels.
Let's talk about security now. We had, a couple of years ago, the Commission recommendation on 5G security. In 2020, we had the 5G security toolbox. We just saw that ENISA was given a mandate to develop some 5G cybersecurity scheme. And it is also on BEREC radar security with high relevance for this year. What should we expect from BEREC side on this important topic?
Yeah, and as I mentioned, and as everyone on the program today knows, I mean, 5G is going to touch on so much of our essential societal services and our daily lives and our integrity, this is going to continue to be, I think, one of the highest priorities, not only for this year, but presumably also going forward and developing with 5G. As you say, BEREC is focusing a lot on cooperating with others in this area. We don't have the biggest mandate in terms of network security, so we cooperate with the ENISAs, with the NIS Council Group, and of course with the European Commission. Last year we had a focus on providing input to some of the objectives in the 5G toolbox, and this year we continue to support the work that is ongoing in the NIS Council Group. I think that's going to stay, presumably, as I said, also a very important task for us to assist and to bring together, in essence, the market people and the security people that are not perhaps as used to meeting each other. So we are a little bit the go-between sometimes.
Thank you. Let's talk rural coverage. We've seen the new Digital Decade document. We will discuss it with Rita a bit later this afternoon, but there the Commission is saying 5G, 100% 5G coverage by the end of the decade. But I see that on the BEREC radar, this is like low importance, time horizon 2022. So high priority for the Commission, but not so high for BEREC. Is that a fair summary?
Well, I would say 2022 comes a long time before 2030, right?
Yes, so but it's not a high. I forgot what it's low or medium priority. It's not like a top priority for BEREC. So, but maybe.
But I mean, coming back also to the lessons learned during the pandemic, I think we have seen the necessity of being connected, and I heard also what Stefan said in his discussion about the digital divide. I think we talk a lot about the digital divide on the last months. Whenever I'm at the conference, we discuss the importance of using the recovery funds well, smart use to connect the unconnected and ensure that connections are workable for families and for work. There are still many parts in Europe that have a long way to go. There are still many parts in a very connected country like Sweden that has a long way to go. So it's a question of degree. There are, of course, those with much bigger challenges in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. There are many who don't have the luxury of being able to connect as we do through secure and robust landlines. They connect through mobile phones, and mobile phones are going to become very important. But then affordability is also going to be very important in many parts of the world. So I think we certainly are aware of this. And coming to the recovery fund and the use of public money to support connectedness, of course, we come to the issue of state aid, where, again, BEREC is not a key player. Of course, it's the European Commission that is the key player. We have views about the definitions, and we feel it's very important that you get the new definitions of what is a good connection to be at a much higher speed than the current regulation indicates.
No, thank you, Dan. Let's discuss a little bit capital expenditures. The digital document, the Digital Decade document, I think is this quite big figure of 65. An investment gap of 65 billion per year, if I remember correctly. And we all know that European telcos, fixed and mobile, invest roughly 50 billion a year. So, you know, to achieve the Digital Decade targets, the telecom operators would have to literally double their capex. Huh? So when we compare the US and Europe, the good news is that, you know, European telecom services look incredibly cheap. You know, probably the European ARPU stand at 50% of US ARPU. The other side of the coin, of course, is that our capex also stand at 50% of the US capex per capita. So I'm wondering, is there any concern in the BEREC community among the long-term capability of our industry to continue to invest, or or is it more, okay, so far it has worked, it's not going down actually, the capex, so no reason to change?
Yeah, no, I think this is a very important and it's a good question. Of course, it's interesting to compare Europe to the US as you do in that question. And you can make that. It's useful to make these comparisons, but you need to be very aware, of course, that Europe is not a unified market. There are big variations inside Europe. There are also big variations inside a market like the US. And the discussion about the ARPUs and the capex and so on, it is true that the ARPUs in the US, they seem to be higher, and they might be as high as twice as high as you mentioned there. What does that lead us to? Do we see more investment in the US than in Europe? I think that's the really important issue. And I think we don't really see, we certainly don't see twice as much investment. I'm not even sure that the figures tell us that we see more investment overall at all. We see higher profitability, and that's something that we as regulators don't necessarily have objections to, but it's not what we're there to ensure, right? So for me, I think this very much comes back to having working markets, providing predictable market situations which are conducive to investments, and I think having different kinds of competitors out there fighting for customers. So I think that's really what's driving investments in Europe, and I think we're doing fairly well. Yeah.
Thank you, Dan. Many other topics you could have discussed around the 5G radar, but I suggest then that we join now Stefan to look at some question which stakeholder send around 5G and about 5G and sustainability. There was one from Vodafone that perhaps you could tackle, Stefan, is do you see 5G as an enabler of green technologies, and does that add more urgency to 5G deployment?
Oh, definitely. I unmute button, the most important button in the new world. No, I definitely see 5G as an enabler of green digital technologies, green development. I mean, I gave some examples from the agricultural management, climate change management. The World Bank has just published a World Development Report, and the key example that they start with in terms of the importance of data and was a climate change example, because they were comparing two tsunamis that hit Japan, but one earlier one, there was no advance information available, and so the number of victims was quite elevated. And then in the second, physically similarly a comparable natural catastrophe, there were advanced warning systems in place, and communication reached the population, evacuations took place, and the number of victims was minimal compared to the similar situation first. So there are so many situations, I mean, where fast data management and data getting the right data to the right people is so critically important. And ecosystem management is also difficult in the sense that it doesn't stop at borders. So I mean, it does require international cooperation, and it does require us to speak in the same language. And when I hear Dan talk about standards and interoperability, that is of course music to my ear. That is exactly what I'm doing as a UN statistics office. I tell everybody those are the standards, those are the rules of the games, but they are not perceived as straitjackets, but as enablers. I mean, that's how we can talk to each other. We can collect our data together, learn from each other, put them together, and address global problems. I mean, like the management of the environment that doesn't stop at national borders.
Thank you, Stefan. And you, Dan, on this very same question, if 5G is an enabler of green digital technologies, Should we speed up? Is it a good reason to speed up the rollout of 5G?
Definitely, and I think as Annemarie mentioned, I think we are happy that BEREC is for the first time taking its first baby steps in terms of finding out what is our role in terms of sustainability. How can we contribute, and how can we perhaps coordinate a little bit the way that I'm sure many of us are already participating in the development, and certainly the stakeholders. There are many examples of stakeholders taking voluntary initiatives. There are, of course, initiatives by government. So there are so many things going on. And of course, if 5G can help more of us being connected to what is going on in this field and use these new smarter technologies. I mean, one thing that one should remember is that if we go back to when 4G was introduced, I think nobody could really foresee exactly what it was going to be used for. And I'm sure that very much the same applies now in terms of 5G. We enable new services, new smarter technologies, but none of us can really foresee. We can look at agriculture, we can look at industry, and we can believe that they are the areas that will be first out. But what it will mean and how it will be possible to do things better, smarter, none of us knows. But connecting everyone is, of course, key to unlocking that power.
Yeah, and then enable those ecosystems to emerge and blossom. Now back to a hardcore telecom regulation. We had two questions, but they're a bit similar for MECTA and Vodafone on spectrum assignment. So basically, what they're saying is that on the fixed side, if a regulator, a national regulator, dreams of regulating fixed market, there is the market analysis procedure, all sorts of transparency procedures, check and balances. But then when we move to the spectrum assignment front, it all happens in a dark room, and the peer review process among regulators is not really a great success. So could BEREC help or not?
Well, I mean, I think that there's a lot of storytelling here. I mean, among BEREC members, I would guess that maybe 1/3 or half of us have the dual competence. We do both things. So we allocate frequencies and we regulate the markets. But then in many other member states, it's separate agencies. I think most of the participants here today, they know this. But that was the reason why we had this new provision coming into the regulation, that there would be these peer reviews, which is something that the RSPG, the spectrum allocating agencies, had already introduced, and that BEREC could participate in those peer reviews. And essentially, a peer review is country A intends to regulate or auction frequencies in a particular way, have specific rules, and then you show it to your peers and you get input. So it's a way of learning from best practice and spreading best practice. And the fear was a little bit that if that's done in a dark room with only spectrum allocating people, you don't really take into account the knowledge and the views of the market part, the BEREC NRA part. So that's what we can contribute, and what we do contribute in those discussions. We are close to the operators. We do understand that having, as I think I mentioned earlier on, predictability in markets and in the regulation that is likely to come in the foreseeable future is very important to have an investment-friendly market situation, and having that is key to get competition moving and working, and therefore to enable companies to do their best to provide good services to consumers at the end of the day. So it all fits together, and I think it's not a big mystery, but
yeah,
I'm happy to see that.
Thank you, Dan. We have another question from BELTEC, the Association of Professional Telecom Users in Belgium. And you know that Belgium we are experiencing some delay in the auctioning of 5G spectrum. and basically BELTIC is asking whether BEREC could help. I mean, they make the question a bit less Belgian than I do it, but I'm translating for you. Can BEREC help when government are dragging their feet to auction spectrum, 5G spectrum?
Well, yes and no. I think the Belgium is certainly not alone in being a little bit late with the 5G spectrum auctions. We saw quite recently the European Commission starting asking questions about the infringements of the deadline for the 5G frequency auctions, and I think they were asked to essentially all countries except a handful, maybe. Sweden certainly got those questions too. So I think it's not unique. And what we can do in terms of sharing experiences, collaborating with each other, that's essentially what we do in BEREC. We share experiences, but at the end of the day, to go ahead to start issuing new frequency bands is a national power, and this is not something that we in BEREC have any powers to influence.
Thank you.
So that would be more for the European Commission if you want to push things, right?
Yeah, yeah. And a quick final question for you again, Dan, from the Hungarian governmental IT development agency. And they basically ask for the alignment. We all know that 5G will require robust backbones to function. So they ask about the alignment of a fiber deployment, to basically power those 5G base stations.
Yes. No, and that, of course, is a very good observation. There will be no real effective large cover 5G unless you have a robust backbone fiber to power the system. So you cannot simply invest in 5G mobile services and believe that that's a shortcut to connect everyone. You need to have both. So the investment opportunities and the market functionality needs to be there, both for fixed line investments and for the mobile part, the base stations and all the other equipment.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Stefan. Thank you really for being with us this morning, I should say, for you, this afternoon for us. I know you've got a busy schedule. I hope it's not the last time that BEREC is the opportunity to cooperate with you and with the UN Statistical Department that you are heading. And congratulations again for your award. Now, without further ado, we will now move to the next session with Rita Wezenbeek. You had just moved to DG Connect recently as the director for connectivity, but many people in the audience remember you as the head of unit in charge of antitrust for telecom for the last few years. So I was saying that perhaps you probably have a few former clients in the room. Yeah. Did they make you take a garden leave when you switch from Com to Connect, or do you just do that over a weekend with a few boxes?
Anyway, I think I stayed within the same team, in the sense that I stayed within the team von der Leyen. And I can tell you in every respect that the transition was seamless, including with respect to holidays. So there were no really holidays in between.
I'm sorry to hear that. I'm really sorry to hear that. Rita, let's move to the topic of the month in Connect, which is, of course, the 2030 Digital Compass. And I remember a year ago, the Commission, it was the beginning of Mrs. von der Leyen presidency, and the Commission issued a communication on Europe's digital future, great document. The Compass covers more or less the same sort of broad topics than the digital future communication. What's different? What's new?
Yes, we think it's not really a change of orientation. It is just a new impetus to accelerate the process that was already going on. And so the reason to come to the compass was very much already underlined by Mrs. von der Leyen in her speech of the Union. I mean, already, so during the COVID period, we could very well see the indispensability of the digital transition. I mean, the COVID crisis only underlined that. So, as the President said, it was really necessary to come with a plan to identify targets for where we wanted to be in 2030, and to also identify what you could call a trajectory. And what the President said was only underlined by the European Council, who also asked for literally a digital compass to move together to the targets to be identified. And in between, there were several groups of member states also urging the Commission to come with such a plan. So this is basically what the digital compass is. It's a plan in which we identify a vision, we identify targets around what we have called 4 cardinal points, and we identify a compass in terms of a governance structure on the basis of which the member states will move collectively with the European Commission to those targets. And there will be a monitoring system based on the DESI index that would allow the Commission, based on what we have called a traffic light system, to signal when we are going into the wrong direction or things are not going fast enough. And in such situations, the Commission could formulate recommendations and work with the member states to take the measures that would be necessary. So then there's maybe still 2 important elements to signal from this digital decade. One is that we would also see the need for what we have called multi-country projects. So if you look at the targets and the areas in which we want to move, there are many areas which underline that only joint action could produce results. So the member states would need to pool resources, and we feel that we need an easy to mobilize vehicle to allow such cooperation with a proper governance structure that would even, let's say, invite the member states to sit together and come with those joint plans. So that's a very important element. And then also a key element with a top priority is our conclusion that it would be good to formulate what we have called digital principles. So these are rights and principles of citizens, consumers, businesses, which would apply in the online world, and which also would define, their position with respect to the digital transition. So we see that very much as a possibility to identify or to define the European digital transition in the European way, so based on European values and convictions.
Yeah, thank you, Rita. And the other priority of Mrs. von der Leyen presidency is, of course, the Green Deal and sustainability. When I don't know if you looked at the BEREC agenda for this afternoon, but there are 2 sessions on sustainability. I didn't see a word on sustainability in the code that was adopted only 2 years ago. Maybe not. Maybe I'm wrong. So, what does the Commission think about BEREC going full speed into sustainability? Is that something that you welcome, or?
Well, sustainability is a top priority for the Commission. You have seen that the 2 priorities for also the Recovery Fund are the digital and green transitions. And we, of course, have the target to be, let's say, climate neutral in 2050, and to increase the greenhouse gas emissions up to 55% in 2030. And we see very much that those goals are linked. And you will see that, I'm not sure, I would have to check also the code for the sustainability.
Yeah, maybe I'm wrong. Don't take my word.
Addressing. Let's both do that. But certainly it's in the digital decade. It's clearly signaled the links between the digital transition and the green transition. So we feel that the digital transition requires high capacity networks to improve connectivity and to move towards the 2030 targets, but also to underline the green transition, because we see that the high capacity networks, in particular fiber and 5G, are much more energy efficient. So these are reasons underpinning the need for the digital transition and to move to the high capacity networks, also in order to further the case for climate neutrality. So I can elaborate if you want. I mean, there are more very good examples also for the green transition.
So I take it as a word of encouragement for BEREC to pursue and persist.
Yeah, you can safely do that. Yes, we would certainly encourage.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we would certainly encourage that, and also like to cooperate with BEREC in these goals.
Well, yeah. Rita, let's now change completely subject and let's talk about a bit of a touchy political subject, the European technological sovereignty. And there I'm reading my notes because I don't want to shoot from the hip and I want to use the right word. So the EU's ambition is to be digitally sovereign in an open and interconnected world. So sovereign but open. And European technological sovereignty starts from ensuring the integrity and resilience of our data infrastructures, networks, and communication. So could you explain how we are going to achieve that?
Yes, the way we see that, and that is also one of the goals of the digital compass, is that we feel that Europe should be master of its own digital transition and master of its own fate in 2030. So when we're talking about digital principles and digital rights, we feel that it is necessary to own our own future. And that means that to a large extent, we also need to own our own tools in order to get there. So it's important that Europe, for instance, where we that I think 80% of European data are processed outside of Europe. Also with respect to the use of.
Look, Rita, I had a few more questions for you, but the connection is not great. So I'm suggesting that we'll see you, Rita, later this afternoon for a Q&A. So I suggest to move a couple of questions we had for you to that part, and then we hand over now to Michel Van Bellinghen, who is BEREC Chair 2021. You're the current BEREC Chair, Michel, also President of the Belgian regulator. And over to you for a session on technological innovation and the impact on end user rights.
Thank you very much, Philippe, and good afternoon, everyone. Today I'll take the opportunity to highlight a work item on BEREC's Work Plan 2021. It is a new workflow we've been mandated with by the European Electronic Communications Code, by co-legislator, and this is something which will reappear on BEREC's agenda from time to time. So I don't need to explain you the dynamics of the technology we use to communicate with family, friends, and colleagues. This is under permanent development, but the technology has changed the way we interact with each other. We've gotten used to sending messages via apps instead of SMS, or parents have embraced video calls, or children communicate via apps that even didn't exist a year ago. So the quick question for BEREC, and what we want to address, is how do the development impact the application of end users' rights under the code? Is the regulatory framework in sync with the developing technology, and does the way in which our online communications develop require an update of consumer protection? And this is exactly what BEREC will do, in our opinion, monitoring the developments in markets, in technology, with a specific focus on end users' rights. Next slide, please. Thank you. Indeed, for the first time, we will publish an opinion on the market and technological developments, and this about different types of electronic communication services. And in this opinion, we will also assess the impact on the application of the right of end users in the code. This is the first time but this will not be the last time, because we will do this at least every 3 years to have a good picture of the development and the impact of the applications on end users' right. Next slide, please. Thank you. So you probably know that end users' rights covers a broad range of different topics, such as information about services, about prices in contract on the website of providers, quality of services, emergency communications, terminations of contracts, and provider switching, but also equivalent access and choices for end users with disabilities. And sometimes the code gives rights to end users of all types of electronic communication services. So this is the case, for instance, for an equivalent access for end users with disabilities. And sometimes the code excludes, the code will leave some of providers out of the scope of some end users' right. This is the case, for instance, for providers of NIICS or providers of machine-to-machine services. And so, as you can see on the slide, BEREC main task is for this year, in this opinion, is to assess to what extent this regulatory framework still meets the 4 core objectives of the code: promoting connectivity, promoting competition, contributing to the development of internal markets, and promoting also the interest of the citizens in the union. And based on the outcome of this exercise, the UN and the Commission will also publish a report on the application of end users' right. And the Commission may submit a legislative proposal if the Commission comes to the conclusions that this is necessary to ensure the core objectives of the code. So, this being said, of course, we plan to engage with stakeholders in this project. And how shall we do that? Because we think this is very important to have very variable thoughts, and we want to know what you think, how do you see the dynamics on the way we communicate, impact the way consumers' rights must be protected. And some of you have already received a letter we addressed to several stakeholders organization at European level with a list of questions, but I will come back to this later on. And maybe back on the slides at the left bottom, you see a series of questions the code asked BEREC to address. And for this session, I would like just to focus and to explore briefly a subset of questions. So, is there sufficient information for end users to make informed choices? And are the end users able to easily switch their providers of electronic communication services? And for that, to give us food for thought, we have invited 2 distinguished speakers. The first speaker is Ms. Monique Goyens. She is a Director General at BEUC, the European consumer organization, representing 45 national consumer associations in 32 European countries, if I'm correct, and acting as a strong consumer voice in Brussels. The second speaker is Mr. Alberto Di Felice. He is a Director of Policy at Digital Europe, the trade association representing digital technology industry in Europe. So, without further ado, I will give the floor to Monique for 5 minutes, please. Monique, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. What I would like to say is that contrary to Stefan Schweinfest, who said that he was stressed to speak in front of a tech-savvy audience, I'm not stressed at all, because it's my job to represent tech-unsavvy people. And I'm very happy that BEREC reaches out to end users and consumers in particular in order to share with you our concerns and our observations on what's going on in the market. So I'm going to dive into that. Thank you very much for this opportunity. First of all, concerning the code, of course, this code is expected to improve consumer rights, and we were very happy when it was adopted. Currently, it is too early to say whether that has been achieved because there is quite a delay in implementation and transposition of the code. So we need a few months more to see where this is heading to. What we can already see now, and that would be also a suggestion or an invitation to BEREC, is to see how the full harmonization status of the code impacts consumers in the EU. Because there is a risk that in some countries, the application of the full harmonization rule under the code might lead to consumers being less well protected than before. So this is something that might be monitored, and that might be also food for thought for improving the next version of the code. And on the other hand, it would be important to monitor how the open-ended clauses of the code that allow for interpretation or for options by member states, how they have been used by member states, and whether they really improve consumer rights or not at the end of the day. Now, concerning your questions, I would like to make 3 remarks. First of all, are consumers better informed, and can they make better informed choices? And there we see worrying developments in terms of transparency and information requirements. For example, the code refers to a contract summary. We believe that that is a very important tool because on basis of a very short document, on the spot, the consumer can easily choose between different operators, because on basis of that summary, they can, depending on the price that they are ready to pay, see the different qualities of services that different providers offer. Now, there seems to be, for example, in Greece, a proposal on the table where the contract summary is nothing else than the first page of the contract. Now, this is not anymore pre-contractual information. It becomes contractual information, and the consumer is not really in a position of mobility where they can shop around. So this is the type of initiatives that we hope will not be maintained in the end in the legislation in Greece, and our members are working to that, but it should certainly not be reproduced in any other member states. When it comes to provider switching, there we see a double problem for the moment. First of all, there are provisions in the code in order to allow consumers to be compensated if the provider switches takes too long. There are abusive or too long delays in switching. However, this is only applicable to internet providers and not to other telecommunication services. And we would encourage BEREC to also monitor the switching delays and sometimes really abuses in any other telecommunications services. The second point is about in the area of switching providers is about termination fees. We see also there, for example, in Portugal, on the one hand, had very long-term contracts, like more than 2 years, combined with very high termination fees if the consumer wants to get out of the contract before 2 years or even more than 2 years. Now, if you impose such high penalties to the consumer, they won't switch. And the whole purpose of having switching and having mobility of consumers in order to make the market more competitive is totally off the table. So people at the end are locked into a contract that they are not happy with. And this is something that we think would be really food for analysis and observation across the EU. The last point I would like to make is about the competition and the takeoff of high capacity networks. And this has been flagged by our Danish member, where it seems that the regulated price of fiber and cable is much above the agreed market price. And it seems in Denmark that cable and fiber owners have already announced price increases to internet providers. And our Danish member expects consumer prices to increase by 20% or even more. Now, this is, of course, not what we would like to see happening in a digital civilization. So those are just a few concerns, because you give me 5 minutes. If you give me an hour, I can fill the hour. But we would, of course, be happy to continue to engage with you before the opinion is adopted, or even, of course, afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monique. Thank you for your encouragement. So now, Alberto, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michel. I have slides. I hope you can see the slides as well as me. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to present to the BEREC Stakeholder Forum today. I think the questions you ask are effectively asking us to see what changes we have seen since the code was finalized in 2018 and now. And this is my next slide, the main question that I will try to answer during my presentation. If you go straight to the next slide, I think a very frank and direct answer is that, frankly, not much has probably changed. I think certainly not anything that would require a change of the code. As we, first of all, Monique has correctly stated that the code has practically just come into effect, and we've seen delays that were highlighted also in previous sessions during the forum. And so effectively, we need to understand first how the rules that were set in the code function in real life. But most importantly, we have seen no fundamental changes in tech trends in the market. As a matter of fact, a major reason for the reform was a well-established a trend in the market that was effectively the shift to IP-based, OTT-based communications. I think 2012 is usually mentioned as the year that OTT messaging surpassed traditional SMS. And this is well before the code was conceived and negotiated. I'm showing here one of the latest stats that I've come across that shows in a very specific segment of the market, the application to person messaging market, so a very specific segment, but reflective of the broader trend that we've known for years now, traditional text messages being stable, as a matter of fact, also increasing somewhat during the pandemic years, but overall as a percentage of the whole volume of messages exchanged being reduced compared to IP-based messaging. And in this particular market, you see an interesting development that it's not only OTT IP-based messaging, but also operator-based IP messaging, which is an interesting development. Next slide. And I think this is exactly the discussion that we had with the code. The code stands largely from the need to reform the rules to make sure that they reflected this shift in consumption of communication services. And effectively, this was reflected in the rules by adopting the functional approach to defining what an electronic communication service is. So with the two categories of number-based and number-independent interpersonal communication service. And also by looking at what type of service effectively you're looking at within the various subcategories and applying the relevant rules. What is interesting is that most rules apply to all services, and that includes the end user provisions, and the relevant exceptions are those related to number independent ICS for very good reasons that are still valid. That is that those rules apply only when there is a direct link with numbers, portability, access to emergency services, so the ability to interoperate with emergency services, and also the switching provisions are also not relevant for a lot of these services because quite objectively the barriers to switching, or rather using multiple apps at the same time to reach the person that you want to communicate to are simply not the same as with traditional services, and therefore those rules are not adapted to those services. With the next slide, I think I can sum up by saying that effectively so far there is no evidence that the market has been changing in the 2.5 years since the code was published in the official journal, particularly when it comes to the letter D of Article 3.2 of the code, which is the part that relates to end user rights more directly, particularly in terms of choice, price, and quality of electronic communication services. There has been quite a lot of work, and BEREC has done a lot of work, including in the draft work program for next year and also this year, on issues relating to data and digital platforms, which are oftentimes interlinked in discussions about electronic communication services. And this is a trend that we've seen. We've seen BEREC very eager to be involved in those discussions, but it's important to keep in mind that the objectives of telecoms regulation, also end user rights that we see in the code, are very specific. And it's dangerous to conflate those objectives with the broader discussions around data and digital platforms. And there are no directly applicable rules that we can simply copy and paste on platform-related issues. And these are being looked at, as you know, in broader discussions around competition enforcement, legislative proposals around the Digital Markets Act, where we also know BEREC is also very eager to participate, in data protection and privacy, as well as other legislative areas. On the other hand, the other objectives, the general objectives of the code that do have an impact on end users' ability to access innovative services, those are still we're still lagging behind, as was highlighted in previous sections. Notably, in terms of investment in new networks and the associated services, but also, as was said by previous speakers, in terms of speeding up implementation of the code and harmonization of the code, which is a key precondition for users, both consumers and businesses, in accessing new services and networks. Think about the many IoT use cases that we expect to see emerge in the market in the coming years. That's my contribution. Thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute now, and of course we'll also reply to the questionnaire and the following consultations that BEREC will hold. Thanks a lot.
So this input will be very important and valuable to assist the discussions within BEREC on the direction of future work until the end of this year, because you know that we will adopt this opinion during the last plenary of this year in December P4. And of course, we are considering all inputs and contributions which are finally introduced as well. But we will also plan to use BEREC study and reports. To start with, the BEREC study on consumer behaviors towards digital platforms as a means for communications. And this study will explore whether consumers are experiencing kind of asymmetries in information, or if they feel locked in or restricted in terms of switching among platforms, or if they are able to switch between the traditional electronic communication services and the digital platforms as a means of communications. Now, some words on a BEREC report. We will also look if we can factor in some of the preliminary results of our BEREC reports on COVID-19 crisis and lessons learned. And for that, we will adopt in plenary 2 a draft report, which will be launched for public consultation. And we will adopt the final version also at plenary 4 by the end of the year. As we could hear today from the different presentations, there are different angles in which we can answer the question from the code. The question BEREC must address in this opinion. But be assured that this opinion will be evidence-based, that this opinion will also take into account all relevant views, and also will live up to Europe's ambition to ensure a high and common level of protection of end user. With that, Philippe, I have concluded for my part, and I'm very happy that we have Rita back again with us for a Q&A session. Over to you.
Thank you. Welcome back, Rita. Thank you, Michel. So another Q&A session. So let's look at another 4 questions that we received from stakeholders ahead of this meeting. The first one is a question from Orange. And Orange is really saying, look, I'm paraphrasing because they send a rather longer question. They're saying mobile operators have to cover 99% of population because of the spectrum licenses. the connectivity toolbox says, yeah, go ahead, guys, share your network. And there is a feeling that the Commission has suddenly become a bit more reluctant to give its blessing to sharing agreement among mobile operators. Rita, perhaps it's a question for you. Is that a correct feeling, or is it a wrong impression?
Well, so maybe just, Philippe, because we had a bit of a wobbly start, I wanted to still also thank you for the invitation, and also underline that the BEREC Stakeholder Forum is a very relevant forum and very good to have these discussions, very relevant to understand what are the issues that BEREC is identifying as priority for the coming period. So thanks. And then on this question, I'm not sure I share the assessment. If you look at the connectivity toolbox, for instance, first of all, the recommendation on connectivity, which was issued in September last year, and the connectivity toolbox, which was adopted only last week, that also addresses network sharing. And I think there's a very balanced approach, which I would feel applies from every perspective within the Commission, also from the competition perspective, which essentially says that network sharing is a good thing, even also for sustainability reasons, but certainly also to enable the rollout of networks, very high capacity networks, also into, in particular, the areas in which this is commercially less attractive. So that is clearly explained. And I think this is something that has always been let's say, advocated from the different, let's say, corners of the Commission. So I think there the policy is undisputed. And of course, we know that there is a case that is being examined, which has been examined for quite some time now. And I am very well familiar with that case, but it has been taken over by my successors. So I would certainly leave it to them to comment on what's the state of play in that case now. But I think our position is consistently, we welcome network sharing, even active sharing, in particular in the areas where this is difficult to roll out. And there may be exceptions, which are right now being examined.
Voilà. So irrespective of the specificities of a specific case, the overall policy hasn't changed. Thank you. No, thank you, Rita, for these comforting words. Now let's move to the next question, which is from Vodafone. And they're really asking whether, Rita, next to the Broadband Cost Reduction Directive and the Radio Spectrum Policy Programme, you see other measures that could help meet the targets set in the Digital Decade document. So what are the other policy tools that you see that could really be brought to bear to achieve these ambitious objectives?
Well, there's one thing that maybe I think interesting to highlight is we've read with interest, of course, the ETNO report that was published, I think, 2 weeks ago by ETNO and the Boston Consultancy Group. And I must say I really welcome the constructive approach taken in that report, and also let's say the wider approach where the report is looking at much more market developments than only those, let's say, in the area of strict connectivity. So it's highlighting also a number of possibilities and opportunities for the telecoms market. And I think, I mean, part of those opportunities are also signaled in the Digital Decade compass. I mean, where the Commission identifies policy goals where we want to be in 2030. I mean, this concerns, for instance, cloud. It concerns the use of data. It concerns data capacity. I think it is very positive by ETNO to identify those elements also as opportunities for the telecommunications industry. And I would say, in a way, the industry is at crossroads. I mean, I'm not sure, and of course we are not the entrepreneurs at the Commission, but I'm not sure that going forward the networks will only be financed on the basis of the consumer model. So there will be much more models that will be probably applicable to the business case of rolling out networks, and part of those models have been identified. And one thing that I find positive and also significant in the report by ETNO is that they say policymakers can help by identifying priorities and setting goals. And I think that is what the Commission is doing in the Digital Decade Compass. So I think that the concept as such also is really trying to be helpful to the operators in the industry.
Thank you very much, Rita. Let's move now to the next question, and perhaps it's more a question for you, Michel. It's actually it's a bit related to the previous topic. It's about and it's a question from DT. Perhaps Simon, you could show it on the screen. It's really a question about I'm reading the massive volume of summaries and reminders that telecom operators have to provide to consumers, while in fact consumers like you and me are increasingly searching on the web the best offer. So is there really a need for operators to do all that work? Shouldn't we simplify the rules, Michel?
Thank you very much, Philippe. Thank you for the question. Unfortunately, it's a little early for us. We haven't not yet mapped the volume of summaries and reminders as put in the question. So it's too early to state what our suggestion would be. But if there is any research on how consumers inform themselves nowadays and how they would like to be informed, this is definitely something that can be shared with us, and we will look into it in the future. Over to you, Philippe.
Thank you. So be a bit of patience. We will hear more in a few months. Thank you. Next question, Simon, is from Facebook, and it's Michel. It's a question that again ties to the previous session on Article 123. So this business of what is the impact of technical innovation on user rights, one that Monique should be interested in. And Facebook is really focusing on number-independent interpersonal communication services, and is asking how BEREC sees, the work in that space of interpersonal communication services, and also the link with Article 61 is the article that talks about interoperability is something that could be imposed in the future by regulators if need be.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Yes, I see two questions actually. So on the first one, yes, we plan a review on the market reading report and material published, and engaging with stakeholders, collecting data from member states in respect to national experiences in the market. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this session, we will publish in June a study on consumer behavior towards digital platforms and NICS as well. So this will give us a kind of empirical insight on the trends on the market and the technological developments as well that we will be assessing. So the second question is the link or difference between two provisions of the code regarding NICS and interoperability. So Article 123 and Article 61. So this is, of course, a total different scope. The first one, Article 61, is about additional powers and competences for NRAs in the toolbox to impose interoperability measures on NICS. So this is about these powers and duties, and then the other provision, Article 123, is about the revision procedure I described, that is to be conducted every 3 years and to be concluded by a report of the European Commission. So, of course, we will make use of this competence as well. I just will add that, of course, we in the past were focusing on traditional operators. We have received new competences, and we will monitor this in light of our new competences as well. Just to remind you that we published a draft report on the way to define and identify harmonized metrics on OTT services. So this is certainly something to look at. And just more specifically, sorry, on interoperability in this Article 123. The way we assess interoperability is about just the way to verify access to emergency services. This again, this is another scope than Article 61. But of course, this being said, if a number of countries that impose obligations of NIICS providers for the lack of interoperability increases, so this is definitely something that we will look at in our future work. Over to you, Philippe.
Thank you, Michel, for this comprehensive response. Rita, Michel, thank you so much for addressing those questions from stakeholder. We now move to the next item on the agenda, a discussion on the call for input for the Work Programme 2022 with Annemarie. Annemarie, welcome back. Welcome back to discuss the Work Programme 2022. You will launch a call for input, I understand.
Yes, I will, Philippe. And just to say that I have thoroughly enjoyed our discussion so far. And this call for input is just as a gentle reminder of what we started out with. This is all this dialogue is also meant to inspire us and give us food for thought to make a ambitious, very relevant, but also balanced working program for 2022. So to help you all remind you of the things that we would like you to do and to tell you where we are at the moment, I have prepared some slides, so I hope we will present them. Thank you. Next slide, please. So this is my call, the call for input, just to remind you of the process and where we are. Next slide, please. Thank you. I can have one extra. Yes, great. So the Work Programme 2022 is, of course, within the strategic priorities that BEREC has defined for 21, which are valid until 25. So all the work that we are doing will have to have a relationship with these three strategic priorities. And just to remind us all, that is promoting full connectivity. I think we have already discussed the importance of the rollout of 5G in the presentations and discussions with Stefan and Dan earlier this afternoon. It is also to support sustainable and open digital markets. And Philippe, just to reassure you, this is the sustainable in this strategic priority refers to sustainable competition. That means competition with a view not only of giving choice to end users and affordable prices, but also enough innovation to help us underline the open digital markets within Europe. And our third strategic priority is in empowering end users. So as you are probably aware, this is our longer term strategic priorities, and our work program every year relates to these priorities. Having said that, maybe on the next slide, at BEREC, of course, there are several elements within our work program. The first element consists of our mandatory projects, which largely stem from the European Code, for example, that asks us to monitor certain things, or as Michel has just explained to us, asks us to provide input on and make analysis, for example, under Article 123. So at present, this element consists of 11 projects, but this list will grow because part of the mandatory projects are, of course, dependent on requests that we may receive from the European Commission. And of course, it is still early in 2021. The demands from the agenda within Brussels may give rise to further questions. So these are 11 mandatory projects that we have found so far. And then there are projects, of course, that carry over from our work this year. analysis that have started, but where we expect that the public consultation will take us, will cross the end of the year, and projects will be finalized in the year after. And then there is the element of the which we deem the quality and efficiency. And these are the projects that we undertake to further the harmonization of the regulation in Europe, to contribute to the quality of our work. So this is the learning part of the NRAs, the exchange of best practices, but also the way in which we consult one another and try to harmonize the way that we put the regulation into practice. So that leaves us with the part on the optional, in the optional work program, which is of course where we are eagerly awaiting your input. That is on the next slide. The optional is now an X, but history shows us that about 30% of our work can consist of these optional projects. And just to remind you, these can ask, suggestions in this field can go on different, all different topics, as long as they relate to our strategic priorities, but they can also ask for different kinds of work. For example, on some topics it is more appropriate to have a workshop. Sometimes one might ask for a monitor or a specific tool to measure development in a certain field. And all these are, of course, should help us to help design better regulation and conditions in the European telco market, to explore new themes, or to create instruments that enable us to do our work better. That's on the additional project. Then on our next slide, maybe just to help you remind how proposals can be submitted, there is the one email address that I hope that you will use and that you will be able to find. It helps us enormously if you submit a proposal which is quite free format, unless you please take into account four dimensions that will help us to make sense of all the ideas that we get in the most efficient way. That is, include a title related to the strategic priorities that BEREC has formulated. Give us a brief description, please, and give us your details so that we can get in touch in case we need any clarification. But I think this is all rather standard procedure, just to remind you of that. And then the final slide will present the timeline. So the first part of the work that we already saw coming, we published at the end of January. Then the call for input already started at the public debrief of our first plenary, so that was end of March. At the moment, we're in the 1st of April, and please take note of the deadline. We have put a deadline for your input on the 19th of April. That leaves you a little under 3 weeks. But we feel this is very important to make sure that at the CN, at the second CN of this year, we have enough time to discuss and collate all the proposals that we have received so that we can formulate a proper draft working program that we can present to the third plenary in autumn. And that gives me to the event that we already touched upon on the end of October, the second Stakeholder Forum that we are organizing this year because of the special COVID circumstances, of course. And so this second Stakeholder Forum will be rather towards the end of the period that we have for the public consultation of the complete draft work program. This will be the one thing that we would like to do during the Stakeholder Forum. The other thing is an ambition that we've had at BEREC for some time now, is that we would like to use the 28th of October to meet not just in this setting, but also to organize the meet and greet with the co-chairs, who are the people really responsible for the work done within BEREC. This is something that we have intended to do much earlier, but the circumstances did not permit us. So that will be on the 28th of October, and then that will give us all time to present a full working program for the 4th plenary in December, so that we can finalize the program just in time to start 2022. That is all for me. Philippe.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Annemarie, for this exciting program. And this meeting of the 28th of October looks really interesting and innovative. I think this meeting with the co-chair will be something that stakeholders are probably looking forward to having. I think we should now move to the next item on the agenda. And actually, talk about co-chair, I'm delighted to introduce one of the BEREC co-chair. That's a perfect transition, actually. Annemarie, you were just talking about stakeholders meeting co-chairs, and we've got one appearing on screen. I'm delighted to introduce Anaïs Aubert, who is co-chair of BEREC Working Group on Sustainability. Anaïs, welcome. Good afternoon. You know, the audience are well familiar with the objectives of the Green Deal. There is no need to remind them. But for myself, could you remind me how the role that the ICT sector plays in the big picture in the carbon emissions?
Yeah, of course.
It's tiny, no?
Because it's tiny. Yeah, it depends. I'm not an expert on the subject. I'm trying to be, but it's a huge subject and very important. And according to different study, the ICT sector accounts for around 4% of total global CO2 emissions. And within this 4%, the communication networks represent 24% of the total.
Of the 4%,
but its estimation,
24%
of this 4%. And it's only regarding CO2 emissions. What we can say today is that internet traffic is increasing significantly, because you know that there are more and more services, more and more connections, more and more connected devices, and this rise has an impact on energy consumptions. And even if data centers and operators are doing a lot of efforts and are taking a lot of initiatives to try to reduce this impact, because there is a rise in the usage, it's difficult that the efficiency gains keep track with this rapid growth of the sector.
But I've seen a number of operators, I'm not sure all, but all the major European operators, they've all announced plan to become carbon neutral by 2050, 40, even some 30. So very soon, that sounds good, no? That's encouraging.
Yes, completely. It's great, and there are lots of initiatives, and that's why actually BEREC want to take a closer look on this subject, not to be left behind, and to be able to understand what is the problem and what the operators are doing, and what BEREC could do in the issue.
Yeah,
and it's underlined also that. Sorry, it's underlined that operators are doing some things on the issue, and that we need to collaborate all together to be able to find solutions.
To find solutions together. Thank you. Now we discuss CO2 emission, carbon footprint. Are there other dimensions under sustainability that should be looked at?
Yeah, of course. CO2 emission are only a tiny dimension of the problem. There is also a problem of consumptions of resources, and as a matter of fact, the most significant impact of ICT on the environment is coming from the consumption of raw materials. So this is particularly due to the consumption of devices. But what I can say is that for now, there are no standardized data collection and methodologies to precisely measure the impact of ICT on the environment. There are lots of work ongoing on this question of methodologies. There are lots of ideas, and various stakeholders are trying to develop some data collection and methodologies. but there are also many different parameters, different scopes for methodologies, different assumptions for these methods, and it's make it very difficult to take decision and to be able to limit the impact. And it's important to work on this.
Yeah, so you think the manufacturing of devices requires, mining activities to get rare earths and other material, and this causes erosion of soil, pollution of soil, and deforestation, other negative consequences, which are of course rather difficult to assess and capture. And I can imagine there are many ways of trying to assess that, and will cause a lot of debates. Now, look, if I put myself in the shoes of a telco, I'm doing my best to cut my carbon footprint. At the same time, the internet traffic on my network grows, but it's for the greatest good. I mean, we heard this morning the Stefan from the United Nations saying, how 5G was going to help sustainability. So yes, our traffic increases, but it's for the greatest good, no? So how do you capture that? Do you just look at the footprint, carbon footprint of the sector, or are you looking at the bright side of the equation and saying what the sector brings to the rest of the economy?
Well, I will talk as me, as a co-chair, and as myself. And this question often comes up when we talk about environmental impact of the sector, and about this positive impact of digital technology on other sectors. But our group is just focusing on the impact of ICT on environment by itself. And I would like to just stress on something and insist on the point that we are network regulator at BEREC. So our mission is really to contribute to the development of networks and to the better functioning of the market of electronic communication, in order to bring all the benefits of networks to the consumers. So our mission is really to develop networks, because we are convinced of all the benefits of technology, networks, 5G, and so on. But that's not because we are convinced of all this positive impact that we should not look at the negative impact and try to do our own homework, if I may say so, and try to reduce this negative part, just in order to try to do something also on what we can do.
No, thank you, Anaïs. Now changing tack and moving back to BEREC. I mean, the code and other pieces of EU law gives a lot of mission to BEREC. I mean, when you look at the work program, you've got a heavy workload. And I mean, we discussed it with Rita earlier, and maybe I didn't look close enough, but I don't have the impression that BEREC has been given any mandate to work on sustainability. So what sort of room for maneuver do you have there without a mandate from the EU legislator?
Yes, so for now, we are not taking any policy or things like that. We are just an ad hoc working group, and we are just trying to understand the issue, actually. So for now, we are trying to develop BEREC expertise on the environmental impact of ICT, and we are trying to understand the different works ongoing on the EU, what is ongoing by other international bodies, other European bodies, NGOs, private actors, just to be informed and to be able to understand what is the impact of the sector we regulate. And for instance, the European Commission is part of our working group. So it's really interesting to exchange with them, to understand what they are doing, and to, more importantly, to try to see what could be our role and to not duplicate what is doing elsewhere.
So you're on the learning curve, both in terms of learning about sustainability and ICT, but also in terms of mapping out all the other institutional players in that space in Brussels and elsewhere. Okay. So you think really BEREC is positioning itself to play a future role, which today is not entirely defined, perhaps?
No, we are really gaining expertise on the issue. You know, our group is very new. We were created last year, and we launched different initiatives, but we are really developing a maturity on this subject, and on this issue, everything is going very quickly. Because, for example, at the end of 2020, and beginning of 2021, the European Commission, within the opinion of BEREC for the revision of BCRD, were asking us to provide information about sustainability regarding the networks. Mm-hmm. So actually, we are trying to develop an expertise because we are asked to do so. Sorry.
Okay, thank you very much. And then the work that you are doing in sustainability is not limited to networks. Are you looking more broadly at the ICT sector, things like cloud? I think I heard you mentioning the cloud earlier. So it's not just the telcos. It's the broad ICT ecosystem, is it?
Yeah, actually, it's true that the BEREC has a core expertise on networks, but for now we are trying to understand the problem, and so for this we need to look at the sector as a whole, because I will take the example of a study from France, from the French Senate, who stated that the networks represent 5% of the environmental impact of the digital sector, so it's a small part. But the impact of the digital sector is also on data centers and devices. So we have to understand all the links and all the interconnection and indirect effects of the networks on other part of the ecosystem, to be able to really understand the problem and to be able to take the appropriate measure to try to tackle the issue. So yes, we are looking at data centers and devices, but just to be able to understand the problem.
To understand the problem. Okay, doesn't mean now digging deeper into what is being done, because I'm sure people in the audience find it fascinating, but they want to know, okay, so what has been done in practice? You know, what is the work that BEREC has accomplished so far? I understand you've got a working group.
So at the beginning we were a networking group, so just a group to be able to discuss about, well, what can we do as a group. So we became an ad hoc working group, so we will exist for 2 years, at least for now. And so we organized 2 workshops in October, where we invited lots of different stakeholders to be able to have a big picture on the problem and to be able to develop a bit the knowledge of BEREC on the subject. And we also took example of our counterparts, for example, RSPG from the Commission, from the energy regulators, and also from private operators. And all the details will be on the website of the event of today, because I provided slides to details, but it was mainly this. We organized this workshop, and we launched a study also, a very broad study on the impact of the telecommunication networks on the environment, with a literature review to be able to have the main information. And this study is undergoing now, and it will be finished, I think, on next fall.
Okay, and so next fall, are you planning to start to engage with stakeholders, or is it premature? Are you doing it already?
Yeah, actually, it was one of the points of our proposition last year. So we launched bilateral meetings with stakeholders, and it's undergoing right now. So we are trying to meet with a lot of different stakeholders, mainly European bodies, NGOs, and European Commission, European Parliaments, and also we are trying to discuss with everyone within BEREC in order to be able to be fully aware of what are the ongoing studies on the subject, because there are lots of initiatives, but also to be able to establish links with this other stakeholders, because we believe that we need to work in close collaboration with everyone and to share our expertise, because we cannot do anything alone on this issue of sustainability. And also it's important for us to be identified as a consulting capacity when it comes to the environmental impact of networks, because we are experts of networks. We are not experts of environment or devices, but we are experts of networks, and it's very important that if anyone is trying to develop knowledge about the impact of network on the environment, that it can consult BEREC.
Right, thank you. And a final question, Anaïs. So we heard you, a working group is working hard, bilateral contact with the stakeholders. There is this big study that we will see the results in the autumn. What is the big next step for BEREC in addition to these three things?
So we as a working group, and of course we think about future, and we propose a few ideas for the next work program for 2022, and we will propose other ideas for the next years. But for now, nothing has been decided, and it will be discussed in plenary. And but we think that it's important to contribute to this topic, and it's also important to collaborate, as I said, and not to duplicate what has been already done. But I believe that Annemarie can probably tell you more about that.
Elaborate on this. Thank you. Thank you so much, Anaïs, for spending part of the afternoon with us and sharing the progress of your working group on sustainability. Thank you. Thank you
very
so
much, Philippe. Bye-bye.
I'm now delighted to, I will be joined now by the three chairs for another go at this question that we receive from stakeholders. So welcome back, Annemarie, Michel, and Dan. Simon, you can perhaps launch the first question. I'm not sure in which order they will appear. This is a question from MVNO Europe, and they are asking the question on whether the report your report, Michel, that you discuss at least this afternoon, will 2022 be a bit too late?
So thank you very much. Yes, I can answer that indeed. Thank you very much, Philippe, for the question. On the first part, the impact on market and technological developments on end users, right? As you mentioned yourself, we had this in the previous session, and we've foreseen this for mid-December of this year, after P4, as I explained. So that's according to the duty that was foreseen in the code. So no, it's not too late. We are, I think, on time, since the code is not yet in effect in many member states, as you mentioned as well. Second part of the question is the internet value chain. I think we received the question also last year when we had a discussion on draft work program 2021. So the internet value chain is something we are planning for a very profound assessment, and this will be indeed delivered in 2022. But discussions between our experts have already started this year, And moreover, BEREC will organize a workshop with all stakeholders and also a think tank in 2021 to provide their views on different parts of the value chain. And this will be taken into account in the preparation of our BEREC report later on. So, indeed, you also know that we are involved in following the legislative process of the DMA proposal. So it's not totally the same, but there is a close link, and for the time being, we are monitoring very closely the legislative discussion on this initiative as well, and we will provide assessment in light of the dynamics of the negotiations to input to the co-legislators. With that, back to you,
But
Philippe.
2020, I take it you saying 2022 is not too late. That's thank you, Michel. Simon, let's go to the next question, which is also from MVNO Europe, and it's on roaming. You know, could BEREC share its view of the recent proposal to modify the roaming regulation? Michel, do you want to?
Yes, I can tell that as well. Thank you very much, Philippe. And so those are just preliminary views, and we welcome, and we still welcome the review of the continuation of the regulation. This is a very good initiative. We very much agree with the principles set out by the Commission, including the new features regarding emergency services, quality of services, and value added services as well. And so in these new topics, they are destined to allow all end users to have more qualitative and informed use on their mobile phone in roaming, which is a very good thing. So we consider, therefore, that they represent an important improvement of the regulation, but this is just a preliminary review because we are currently assessing this proposal in more details in order to provide inputs on practical aspects, and so we also assess whether some of the proposal of the Commission should be further detailed, either in the regulation or in BEREC guidelines. But we will have a BEREC opinion, normally speaking, within 1 month at the beginning of next month in May. Over to you, Philippe.
Thank you, Michel. Simon, next question, please. Yeah, it's again on roaming. Maybe Dan, you could handle it. Will BEREC have a public consultation on its input to the roaming regulation? So,
okay, I can certainly have a start. So this is, I believe, a recurring theme for discussions with stakeholders. Of course, a BEREC opinion is something that we form having discussions within the group, and the way that the different NRAs form their views can, of course, include discussing with stakeholders. And normally speaking, we do not, as a rule, consult on our public draft public opinions. It has happened that we have chosen to do so in the past. I'm not up to speed really on whether this is one of those rare occasions when we believe there is a need for it, and indeed time enough for us to do so. I don't know if Michel, maybe you can say something if that has been discussed.
Simon, next question, please. That's for you then. If it's on the work program 2022, it's for you, Annemarie. So would you consider adding a point on roaming outside the EU? So this is a question from BEUC, the consumers. We had Monique earlier this afternoon with us, but BEUC is still with us. So, you know, what should BEREC add to next year work program, something on protecting European consumers when they roam outside the EU, or the EEA, I should say, if our Norwegian friends and others are connected.
Yeah. Well, it is an interesting point that BEUC has made. The thing, so I do think this is something we could consider. At the same time, we have to be realistic on the capabilities that we have. And of course, at present, there is a process we are in a process, or the European Commission is in a process of reviewing the roaming regulation. So we seriously have to look at the capacity that we may or may not have, given the fact that if we have a change in implementing new rules, then that will take up a lot of our capacity. So although I think it's a very interesting point, and I would be happy to consider it and discuss further, we do have a capacity constraint given the fact that the European Commission is at present reviewing the regulations, and that will keep us busy as well.
Thank you, Annemarie. Next question, please. I think I can take one from my list. Yeah, that's right. It's another. Let's do it. That's another question from BEUC. Asking, can BEREC help to improve comparison tools for bundle contracts? So apparently BEUC is saying when you have to choose between compare two services, that's fine, but to compare two bundled contract, it's more challenging. Can you help?
Yeah, maybe I can take this as well, because this is something that is also a suggestion for new work.
You're working for ACM, so you've got a more interest even than other regulators in protecting consumers.
Yes, but as you can imagine, as incoming BEREC Chair, I have to have a well-balanced working program. So there's what I can do from ACM, Philippe, and there's what we can do with BEREC.
Behind your back, there is the Authority for Consumers and Markets. So you remind us all the time that.
Well, this is basically to hide all the mess that's behind. That's what you use a banner for, Philippe. So, anyways, no, on bundled contracts, of course, we've had a report in 2016, so that's quite a while ago, where BEREC has taken the point that the bundling can hinder transparency. And 2016 is, of course, quite some time ago. And I know that several NRAs have developed tools to increase the transparency. And I also know that regulators in other fields, such as energy, for example, have had similar. So we may consider also discussing this as a possibility for next year. Where we can, for example, exchange these best practices and see what we can learn. If individual NRAs would be interested to take some action, then of course we should take the opportunity to learn from one another. So this is again a suggestion I'm very happy to take on board and review, because the work from 2016 is probably can use an update.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Annemarie. Simone, next question, please. So, how can BEREC make the peer review effective and transparent? So, who wish to handle that? Is it? I guess I don't know the context of this question. Whether it was whether it's the peer review in the context of the spectrum auction. I guess that's probably where you've touched upon that in the introduction in your initial presentation on 5G. Dan, I don't know whether we want to add something.
I think I have essentially addressed the BEREC role in the RSPG peer review process, and we contribute with the market knowledge and feel that we may have to that process. I don't really have much more to add.
Okay. Thank you. I'm sorry, I forgot. I cannot add to the context of that question. Sorry for the person who asked. Next question. This is a question from ECTA, and they are asking, they essentially the context of this question is too much focus on B2C markets or about BEREC taking more action to improve competition in B2B markets. And by the way, they say 5G is by and large a B2B market. Voilà, that's the context of the question. Who wants to pick that up? Do you want to have a go, Dan? Or?
I can have a go at that as well. My colleagues can complement if they feel like it. Of course, promoting competition is a core competence, and it's really at the center of BEREC's actions, and that's both B2B and B2C, of course. And I spoke to some of that in my earlier statements. I think there are many things we do, monitoring the functioning of the market, reporting on developments. And I think by and large, much of that works fairly well. You had a question for me about the profitability in Europe compared to the US, for example, and I think we are happy to have lower costs for electronic communication in that comparison, and we are happy to see that there are still plenty of investments going in, not least into the 5G space, which is developing very quickly across Europe. And should we do more for B2B markets in particular? I'm not sure. I think we need to look equally at B2B and B2C, and I think that's in the program we have.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dan. Next question, please. Yeah, so it's about this. This is a very interesting question, which we got from Open Fiber during the afternoon, and Stefan from the UN Statistic Office should have stayed with us. The Open Fiber is asking whether the collection of data for monitoring progress against the digital decade targets, all the figures, will they come from DESI, or will the Commission and BEREC have a separate collection of data? Essentially, that's the question. Okay, so full coverage of 5G and gigabit available to all households by the end of the decade. These are the targets. Open Fiber says, how will the Commission or will BEREC go after collecting the data? Will it just be the normal way it's done for DESI, or will there be a separate exercise? It's a question that just came now. I'm not sure whether we are able to answer it straight away.
I can start if you like, Philippe, but of course I cannot speak on behalf of the Commission. I guess that Rita is not with us anymore, but those are different topics. So and of course. We're not such involved in the DESI exercise, and we have our own workflow as we described in our work program. So, if I remember, because the question now disappeared, if I remember the question correctly, if this will remain two different and separate workflow or not, and I think this is the case for the time being. But again. It's a pity that,
so it will be a different effort of collecting data, different from what is done for DESI. Yeah. Is what you're saying, Michel?
There are different workflows. That's just what I'm saying now.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. We'll I'm sure that's well, especially after having Stefan with us for this afternoon. I now take statistics even more seriously than in the past. Simon, next question, please. What is in BEREC's view on the final connectivity toolbox? Do you see it as fully utilized? So do you think that the connectivity toolbox is fully utilized, or could you see other measures that could be leveraged to reach the ambitious target of the digital compass? It's a question from DT.
I can take this as well, Philippe. So, and we very much welcome this initiative of the Commission, and we would like to be in 2030 already to see what happens by then. But of course, you will remember that we adopted last year a new strategy, 2021-2025. I'll come back to that in a moment. And in this strategy, we have one of priorities regarding promoting full connectivity. And in this toolbox, the policies priorities set out in the digital decades are governed precisely by the vision that connectivity is the most fundamental building block of the digital transformation towards the gigabit society. This is something we absolutely need for all parts of the society in order to transition to a healthy planet, and Europe that is fit for digital decade. And looking back to our strategy, BEREC strategy 2021-2025, this reflects an identical conviction as well. And if I can just speak 1 minute on at national level here in Belgium, this is also something we really welcome. In a previous session was a question addressed to Dan regarding 5G in Belgium. We will remember, we also try as regulator to talk with different policy makers and to help and to speed up the rollout because of the importance of connectivity objectives as a whole. And we know that there are different hurdles to connectivity as well. So I'm pretty optimistic that for the telco operators, this toolbox will improve the rollouts to be put in place. And there are other initiatives which are very much welcome, like, of course, the review of the urban cost reduction directive. This is still underway. The upcoming 5G plan as well, and mainly as a horizontal priority for BEREC, the correct and timely implementation of the code, even if that's correct too, that's the reality. Many member states haven't transposed this code into their national legislation yet. With that, back to you, Philippe.
Thank you, Michel. Simon, would you show the next question, please? Yeah, that's a question from Telefonica, and Telefonica is asking, will BEREC, as an input to the DMA proposal, elaborate on its view of the open internet? And the fuller question that we received reminds, BEREC that the full internet is just not only telecom networks, that's an important part, of course, but also other elements in the ICT ecosystem. So will you want to have a go at that, Annemarie?
Yes, please. Thank you. Well, we are still, we have put out our opinion on the DMA proposal already, but we are still working on a report that we will finish at P4. We will finalize at P4, and that contains several ideas. And one of the things that we are thinking about is the relationship between the DMA proposal on the one hand and other acts or pieces of regulation that we are enforcing, and the open internet being one of them. So this is an issue that we are still currently considering. And as our work on the DMA proposal and our inputs are still very much underway and will be finished only at the end of the year, we will do some. We will take aspects of the open internet on board. I am not sure whether we will go to the full extent of the question of Telefonica, because at present, as I said, one of the things that we have to look into is the interplay between the DMA on the one hand and, for example, the code and the open internet. So the acts that we are that are within our remit are very much part of the thinking that we are now undertaking, and the conversations that we are having with the co-legislators.
Thank you, Annemarie. Next question, please. Yeah, so it's again a question on BEREC transparency. So we're now talking about market analysis and phase 2 cases, so the cases where BEREC, the Commission, disagrees with one of your members, and BEREC is called in to give his opinion. So could we? The question comes from ECTA, and ECTA is asking, could we make this process more transparent, this phase 2 cases more transparent, and allow stakeholder engagement, every party to.
Yep. Maybe I can start there, because it was also part of the elements of our work program that we have every year. So Dan and Michel will have a similar experience. So we explicitly mentioned the phase 2 cases under efficiency, because of course the procedure here regards the goal that we all have to harmonize the way that we regulate the telecom markets throughout the European Union and the European single market. And these phase 2 cases are, of course, decisions that we take on national decisions. And these national decisions already have known their national involvement of the relevant stakeholders, as well as very often public consultation. So in the process of these phase 2 cases, this is a whole different process on which the Commission has just published new guidelines, but the relevant involvement of stakeholders has already taken place beforehand at the national level. So we do not foresee broad European consultation at that particular stage.
Thank you, Annemarie. That's a very clear answer. And Simon, I think there is one more question, and then our time is up. We should probably stop there. Yeah, I think it's a question from an analyst, Dean Bubley, and he's saying, I'm translating or paraphrasing, he's saying, is BEREC doing enough to cultivate both the 5G environment, but also alternative technologies that may emerge around unlicensed spectrum ecosystems? I guess that's a way of translating this. So Dan, do you think that BEREC is too 5G focused and it does enough to develop other ecosystem around, I don't know, Wi-Fi 6, I think would be the contender?
Yeah. Well, look, I think we are very much aware of the value of biodiversity, if you call it like this. We want competition to take place between competitors that are not aligned in their interests and in their structures, in their capital availability and so on. So smaller, bigger, newer, different technologies. I think we're very much attuned to that argument. Now, as it is, I mean, getting 5G implemented and up and running in Europe is a huge task as it is. So I think it's natural that we devote a lot of focus to that we have this as a priority for this period up till 2025. That doesn't mean that we're uninterested in alternative technologies. I think we pride ourselves in trying to be technology neutral. And if there are good inventions coming up, seeking access to markets where we can be helpful, I'm sure we will be listening to that.
Thank you, Dan, for that contribution. Michel, Dan, thank you very much for these answers. Anne-Marie will have a short video now, a transition video, and we'll see you in a minute for the closing remarks. Voilà. Thank you. Thank you. Welcome back, Anne-Marie. Congratulations for, I think, a great stakeholder forum. I'm not in the best position to comment because I was part of it, but I enjoyed it. I found it really interesting. Of course, a bit on sustainability, or a bit sort of different from what other topics that are more classic, if you like. But overall, I thought that was a very nice event. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Philippe, for steering us through the tricky canal of managing everything in time. And I think that what we have tried to do today is to start the dialogue or continue the dialogue that we have. And I personally have gained a lot of insights and inspiration for the work program 2022. So I want to thank all the participants, be they presenters, discussants, or people who have asked questions for their contributions, because it helps us a lot. I also want to reassure everyone who has asked questions that did not make it to this digital stage that we will take them on board, and where appropriate, forward them to the working groups that will take them on board and consider them and use them to their advantage. And that just leaves me with, again, thanking everyone for having such an insightful discussion. And this only leads me to looking more forward to our real live stakeholder forum at the end of October, where, Philippe, I hope to meet you again. So I hope that you have already blocked your agenda for Brussels for the 28th of October of this year.
To meet in person, hopefully.
To meet in person.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anne-Marie, and good evening, everyone. And we hope to see you on the 28th of October in person in Brussels.